What if JFK was never assassinated? On November 22, 1963, a series of events unraveled in Dallas, Texas, that forever altered American history. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy not only robbed the nation of a young, charismatic leader, but left behind a series of what-if questions that continue to fuel speculation and debate to this day. What might have been different had JFK survived that fateful day? How would American society, domestic policy, and global geopolitics have shifted under his continued leadership? In this speculative exploration, we aim to unpack the possibilities, inviting political analysts and viewers to consider the ripple effects of Kennedy's hypothetical survival. President Kennedy often referred to the United States as a new frontier, encapsulating his vision of progress, modernity, and reform. Despite his limited legislative accomplishments during his short presidency, his vision promised transformation on multiple fronts. Would a second term under his leadership have fulfilled that promise? The civil rights movement was reaching a boiling point during JFK's presidency. His administration had slowly begun addressing systemic racial injustices, but progress was deliberate and cautious, out of fear of alienating Southern Democrats. If he had survived, could JFK have pushed forward groundbreaking legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 himself, rather than leaving it to Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency? Some speculate that his moral support for the movement, combined with his symbolic position of unity, could have accelerated desegregation and racial equality. Others believe his survival might have also spurred fierce opposition, slowing progress and creating continuous gridlock in Congress. Beyond civil rights, Kennedy envisioned building a stronger social safety net to combat poverty. It is worth considering whether his policies on healthcare, education, and economic reform might have planted earlier seeds for the programs Lyndon Johnson later dubbed the Great Society. If Kennedy had remained in power, would America's welfare systems have looked significantly different? His administration showed nascent ambition, but critics often framed Kennedy as more of an orator than an implementer. Would a second term have proven them wrong? Kennedy's presidency unfurled during the height of the Cold War, global tensions shaping much of his diplomatic and military strategies. More than any other aspect, his second term posed intriguing possibilities in foreign policy. The Vietnam War stands as one of the gravest and most defining conflicts of the mid-20th century. Under Kennedy, U.S. involvement was measured but growing. Advisors debated force escalation, while JFK himself often expressed reservations about full-scale commitment. Had he remained in office, it is plausible that Kennedy might have resisted further military escalation, potentially avoiding the full-fledged quagmire that consumed the United States under Johnson. In Cuba, JFK's presidency had already faced immense trials. From the Bay of Pigs disaster to the brinkmanship of the Cuban Missile Crisis, his relationship with Fidel Castro's regime was fraught but tempered by pragmatism. Could a longer JFK presidency have opened pathways toward detente with Cuba, or would the embargo and hostilities endured indefinitely? As for the broader Cold War dynamic, Kennedy's careful diplomacy with the Soviet Union hinted at the potential of earlier negotiations on arms control. While the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 was a step forward, would a second term have brought expanded agreements or even an earlier easing of tensions between the superpowers? Such possibilities remain tantalizing, especially given reports of JFK's private conversations about steering the Cold War into safer waters. As much as Kennedy's presidency is remembered for its policies, it is also remembered for its symbolism. His youth, eloquence, and optimism represented a break from the stodgy leadership of the Eisenhower era, infusing a sense of hope during testing times. The power of that symbolism resonates further in the hypothetical scenario of his survival. Had he continued as president, JFK might have served as a uniting figure during the social and cultural upheavals of the 1960s. The civil rights demonstrations, the counterculture movement, and the growing frustrations of working-class Americans often felt like diverging forces ripping apart the nation. Would Kennedy's charm and emotional connection with the public have served as a force of cohesion? Or would his administration, battered by protests, congressional battles, and inevitable criticism, have seen him become a figure of division? Furthermore, his survival would have likely cemented his re-election in 1964. Given rising satisfaction with his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the building blocks of economic progress through tax reforms, Kennedy likely would have won another term. But what might his campaign themes have been? Would his agenda have reflected continuity or ambitious new initiatives? Such questions underscore the untapped potential of a leader never afforded the opportunity to complete his vision. Presidential legacies are often built on cumulative influence, from long-lasting legislation to judicial appointments that shape the U.S. legal system for generations. JFK's survival could have left an indelible mark on both fronts. Consider the opportunity to make more judicial nominations for the Supreme Court. Kennedy had already appointed Byron White, known for his moderate stance, to the bench. Given the evolving challenges of the 1960s, from civil rights cases to privacy issues, Kennedy's appointees could have profoundly influenced landmark rulings. Would Roe v. Wade or Miranda v. Arizona have unfolded differently with a Kennedy-era court? Domestically, issues such as healthcare were nascent under Kennedy, but gained sharper focus after his death. The hypothetical survival of JFK invites speculation about whether policies like Medicare and Medicaid would have materialized in the earlier 1960s, possibly even in altered forms. Might his leadership have redefined American healthcare decades before the debates we continue to have today? Beyond American borders, JFK's survival might have set new tones for U.S. relationships with global players. The space race, for instance, stands out as one of Kennedy's defining areas of focus. His bold goal to land an American on the moon by the end of the 1960s inspired a generation. Completing that promise under his presidency could have consolidated him as a transformational figure in science and exploration. But would the moon landing itself have accelerated under Kennedy's personal oversight, or did the tragedy of his assassination galvanize the nation's efforts in the subsequent years? Similarly, the Middle East, with its growing tensions, offers room for speculation. How might JFK have handled early conflicts in Israel and Palestine, or emerging complexities in the Gulf states? Would his approach have differed significantly from his successors, altering patterns of U.S. intervention in the region for years to come? Kennedy's rhetoric and international reputation also created the perception of America as a leader of progressive global ideals. Programs like the Peace Corps, deeply tied to his presidency, were more than foreign policy tools. They were symbols of American soft power. Might his survival have expanded such programs even further? Ultimately, the exercise of speculating on Kennedy's survival leads to broader reflections on the role of leadership in shaping the course of history. Leaders are conduits of vision, change, and unity, but they are also constrained by circumstance, opposition, and larger historical forces. Was JFK uniquely positioned to influence these forces, or did his tragic death magnify his legacy beyond what a prolonged presidency would have achieved? Perhaps most compellingly, the scenario of JFK's survival reminds us of history's delicate balance. A single event, an assassin's bullet, ended a presidency, but also redirected the course of a nation's domestic policy and global standing. Such moments challenge us to appreciate the weight of leadership, the fragility of circumstances, and the unforeseen consequences of even the smallest historical pivots. As we conclude this speculative journey into an alternate history, the unresolved possibilities of a second JFK term leave us with as many questions as answers. Would he have been a unifying figure, or a president mired in the divisive challenges of the 1960s? Could he have prevented the devastation of the Vietnam War, or would external pressures have driven escalation regardless? Might his idealistic rhetoric have transformed into meaningful progress, or would the limits of political and cultural realities have curtailed his potential? These questions are not merely academic. They resonate deeply with today's political realities, underscoring the interconnectedness of leadership, vision, and the forces of history. For political analysts, the JFK hypothesis is not only a lens to reimagine the past, but an opportunity to derive lessons for current leaders grappling with global challenges, systemic inequalities, and cultural fragmentation. We invite you to reflect, debate, and consider. What if JFK had lived, and what might that teach us about the leadership we need today? Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.